of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threat to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, the Under-Secretary General, United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, and Ms. Michelle Conins, the Executive Director, Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2020/774, the 11th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL Daesh to international peace and security and the range of United Nations efforts in support of member states in countering the threat. Now, before giving the floor to Mr. Vladimir, I just would like to remind colleagues that there's a microphone that is still open. Could you please all check whether your microphone is silent and mute? All right. Now I give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Voronkov. Vladimir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning to all. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, let me begin by expressing my profound condolences to Afghanistan, Chad, France, Nigeria, Somalia, the United Kingdom, and all member states which have recently suffered terrorist attacks. My heartfelt thoughts and sympathy go to the survivors and families of the victims. I thank you for the opportunity to brief the Security Council on the 11th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL to international peace and security and the range of the United Nations efforts in support of member states in countering this threat, as mandated by the Security Council Resolution 2368/2017. The report was prepared by the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team of the ISIL and Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee, led by Mr. Fitton Brown, and the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, led by Madam Conins, in close collaboration with my office and with contributions from other United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Committee. Mr. President, this report covers a period like no other, marked by the COVID-19 pandemic affecting virtually all member states. This pandemic environment raises several strategic and practical challenges for counterterrorism, which we discussed during the virtual counterterrorism week organized by my office last month. Our discussions during the virtual counterterrorism week showed that states need to stay attuned to how the ISIL threat evolves during and after the pandemic. They also emphasized the need to sustain the focus and resources required to address the persistent threat posed by ISIL and the continuing challenges posed by foreign terrorist fighters. Since the start of the year, we have seen contrasting regional disparities in the threat trajectory. In conflict zones, the threat has increased, as evidenced by ISIL's regrouping and increasing activity in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, and among some of its regional affiliates. However, in non-conflict zones, the threat appears to have decreased in the short term. Measures to minimize the spread of COVID-19, such as lockdowns and restrictions on movement, seem to have reduced the risk of terrorist attacks in many countries. Yet, there is a continued trend of attacks by individuals inspired online and acting alone or in small groups, which could be fueled by ISIL's opportunistic propaganda efforts during COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic's impact on recruitment and fundraising activities remains unclear, as its socioeconomic fallout could exacerbate conditions conducive to terrorism and increase the medium to long-term threat both within and outside conflict zones. Meanwhile, there is no clear indication of a change in ISIL's strategic direction under its new leader. Command and control arrangements between the ISIL core and its remote provinces have continued to loosen, thereby strengthening regional affiliates. Mr. President, I would like to highlight some developments in different regions. In the Middle East, the ISIL core has continued to consolidate its position in some areas previously under its control, operating increasingly confidently and openly. More than 10,000 ISIL fighters are estimated to remain active in Iraq and Syria, moving freely in small cells between the two countries. There has been a significant increase in ISIL attacks in both countries in 2020 compared to 2019. The COVID-19 crisis has further complicated the already dire and unsustainable situation of thousands of individuals with suspected links to ISIL who are stranded in the conflict zone, especially women and children. Repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration, and the protection of the vulnerable have become more urgent. While some states have repatriated and continue to repatriate children, we have seen only limited progress in overcoming legal, political, and practical hurdles to repatriation. The global threat from ISIL is likely to increase if the international community fails to meet this challenge. Decisive action is required from member states on humanitarian, human rights, and security grounds. The Secretary General reiterates his call on member states to meet their obligations under international law and repatriate their nationals, women, men, and children. The United Nations system stands ready to support their efforts in this regard. Turning to Africa, the Islamic State in West Africa province, ISWAP, remains a major focus of ISIL global propaganda, and its total membership of approximately 3.5 thousand make it one of the largest of the remote provinces. ISWAP continues to reinforce links with the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which remains the most dangerous group in the tri-border area of Burkina Faso, Mali, and the Niger. Although ISIL has only a few hundred fighters in Libya, it has been exploiting local tensions between ethnic groups. It represents a potent threat capable of broader regional impact. The risk of escalation of the conflict in Libya could allow ISIL to expand its activity. Another worrying development is the attacks staged by Islamic State Central Africa province in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Mozambique, including complex attacks and brief takeovers of villages. In Europe, the threat continues to come mainly from internet-driven, homegrown terrorist radicalization. 3 ISIL-inspired attacks occurred in France and 2 in the United Kingdom during the reporting period, while other attacks by lone actors against soft public targets were thankfully foiled. Acute concerns persist about radicalization and failed rehabilitation in prisons, and the imminent release of dangerous inmates with a terrorist background or connections. Several member states in Europe report a growing terrorist threat from the right-wing violent extremism, which requires intelligence services to shift their operational and analytical priorities away from a focus on ISIL. In Asia, ISIL's affiliate in Afghanistan remains capable of high-profile attacks in various parts of the country, including Kabul, despite continued territorial losses and the arrest of its leaders. The group seeks to use Afghan territory to spread its influence across the region, similar to the approach of ISIL's core. It also aims to attract fighters who oppose inter alia the peace agreement reached between the Taliban and the United States. In other parts of Asia, ISIL claimed its first attack in the Maldives in April. Concern remains over the recruitment of ISIL fighters in the country and the looming challenge of managing returnees from the core conflict zone. In Southeast Asia, attacks on security forces occur regularly, but government authorities have maintained pressure on ISIL activities through counterterrorism operations. Mr. President, the report of the Secretary General also highlights how United Nations system have continued to actively support member states over the past 6 months despite the pandemic. After the COVID-19 outbreak, United Nations entities swiftly adjusted their operations to ensure business continuity. Collaboration under the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact continued with regular virtual meetings and joint projects. At the end of March, my office launched the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Platform to further facilitate this process and engagement with member states. I have already reported to the Security Council on the outcomes of the successful Counterterrorism Week in July. My office has worked closely with CITED and other compact partners to incorporate flexible approaches in our capacity building support to member states, including by using online platforms and developing remote needs assessment methodologies. I would like to draw your attention to a few key activities of my office. First, we led the development of a multi-agency framework to provide coordinated United Nations support to requesting member states on the protection, repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of third country nationals returning from Iraq and Syria. The framework, coordinated by my office and UNICEF, aims to ensure that this support is human rights compliant and gender sensitive and takes into account the best interests of the child. Second, we continued prioritizing our work on victims of terrorism, including encouraging member states to identify specific actions to uphold their rights in national counterterrorist strategies. The commemoration of the International Day of Remembrance of and a tribute to the victims of terrorism last week reminded us that we need to do more to support victims. In particular, more needs to be done to address sexual violence committed by ISIL, both in terms of accountability and support to victims. Third, countering the financing of terrorism remains a key priority. The pandemic increases the potential risk of cybercrime by terrorists to raise and move funds. In June, the United Nations Counterterrorist Center in my office, together with CITED, UNODC, and the Office of Information and Communications Technology, launched a new global capacity building program for the prevention and suppression of the financing of terrorism, in line with Security Council Resolution 2462, 2019. Fourth, my office has continued to partner with a broad range of entities to support member states in law enforcement and border security. The United Nations Countering Terrorist Travel Program, led by my office, to support member states in implementing Security Council Resolutions 2178, 2014, 2396, 2017, and 2482, 2019, currently has 36 confirmed beneficiaries in different regions. The program adapted to the COVID-19 crisis by developing, together with CZ, an online assessment methodology that was first used in June in Côte d'Ivoire. Lastly, during the high-level open debate convened by the Indonesian presidency earlier this month on addressing the issue of linkages between terrorism and organized crime, we discussed the need to tackle the illicit supply of small arms and light weapons to terrorist groups. UNOCT, UNODC, CITED, and the Office for Disarmament Affairs launched a joint project in February focused on Central Asia to address this phenomenon. Mr. President, the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the challenges we face in eliminating the threat of terrorism. ISIL and other terrorist groups seek to exploit the far-reaching disruption and negative socioeconomic and political impacts of the pandemic. As emphasized during the virtual Counterterrorism Week, strengthening collective action and international counterterrorist cooperation must remain a priority during and after the pandemic. As member states continue their efforts to develop comprehensive responses to the threat posed by ISIL and terrorism, they can count on the full support of my office and the United Nations system through the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact. I thank you, Mr. President.
Okay. Thank you. I thank the VSG Voronkov for his statement. Now I would like to invite Michelle Conins. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the 11th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL and the continued efforts of the United Nations and Member States to counter the threat. I would also like to thank Yoshi Voronkov for his overview of the report and to commend both UNOCT and the Analytical and Sanctions Monitoring Team of ISIL and Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee led by Mr. Fitton Brown for their invaluable contributions to the report. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the greatest challenges faced by the United Nations in the 70 years of its history. The resulting period of global uncertainty has exposed existing economic fault lines and social instabilities. And its impact has also been felt across the global security apparatus. As we have heard, the rapidly evolving and deeply uncertain nature of the pandemic makes it difficult to assess its overall impact of ISIL's activities. The dire situation faced by thousands of ISIL-associated women and children in the detention camps of northeastern Syria remains a major challenge for the international community. The COVID-19 pandemic risks exacerbating an already untenable humanitarian, human rights, and security situation. Indefinite detention is legally unjustifiable and has significant security and moral implications. The detained children remain the most vulnerable group. Every additional day that they spend in the camp will increase the risk that they will suffer irreparable psychological damage. Last month, CEDAC published an analytical brief on the prosecution of ISIL-associated women, highlighting the gender-specific challenges encountered by states in the investigation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of women returnees. Women remain the group with the lowest rate of return from the conflict zone. We can't allow these women to become the forgotten demographics. There is an urgent need to institutionalize comprehensive, tailored, and gender-sensitive PRR strategies and to provide states with the required technical assistance. There have been signs of progress. Some states have repatriated their citizens despite the additional challenges posed by COVID-19. Some states are also making progress in prosecuting ISIL returnees for terrorist-related offenses, sometimes together with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. This may help provide justice to the victims of ISIL. States should continue to improve the collection and sharing of admissible terrorism-related information and evidence by the military in compliance with international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And CTAD is working in partnership with UNODC and UNOCT under the Global PR Initiative to explore approaches to rehabilitation and reintegration in various settings. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, pandemic-related restrictions, including social isolation measures, curtailed religious and cultural activities, and lack of employment opportunities may aggravate existing grievances, particularly in societies facing endemic conflicts. And with people spending more time online, ISIL and its affiliates are taking the opportunity to accelerate the spread of their toxic propaganda via digital platforms, including gaming platforms. And member states must ensure that policies adopted to curtail the spread of terrorist narratives and misinformation are human rights compliant and gender sensitive. A whole of society approach based on consultation with relevant stakeholders, including civil society organizations, academia, think tanks, religious actors, and community leaders is more crucial than ever. Within the framework of the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, CTAD continues to engage with states, including in partnership with the government of Iraq, on the development of comprehensive and integrated counterterrorism strategies that engage a wide range of stakeholders. States should introduce innovative and practical counterterrorism measures, strengthen existing partnerships, and ensure that victims' rights are respected. I welcome the adoption in March this year of the interfaith statement on victims of ISIL by the leadership of religious authorities in Iraq, which aims to secure justice and accountability and protect the rights of victims and survivors of ISIL. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, despite its significant loss of territory, ISIL continues to pose a threat, not only in the Middle East, but also in the newer battlegrounds of Southeast Asia, the Lake Chad Basin, and the Sahel. And we're closely following the current political crisis in Mali and hoping for the restoration of the rule of law in order for this country to continue its fight against the rise of the terrorist threat. Our response to the enduring transnational challenge must be a multilateral one, rooted in enhanced information sharing and international cooperation. CTAD has innovated its working methods in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and maintained business continuity despite the challenging circumstances. Acting on behalf of the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee, we have enhanced our desk-based stock-taking of member states' activities and assisted the committee to adopt an updated counter-visit framework, as well as the annual list of briefings and meetings for the committee and this wider membership. Under the UN Countering Terrorist Travel Programme, CTAD and its partners have conducted virtual deep dive missions for Botswana and Côte d'Ivoire and developed API PNR implementation roadmaps for both states. CTAD also led a virtual deep dive mission for Botswana with its partners on enhancing the capacity to counter terrorism using national level interagency coordination mechanisms, so-called fusion cells. CTAT and UNOCT have held joint consultations with member states and experts on the use of biometric technologies for pandemic-related measures aimed at ensuring their compliance with international human rights law. We have deepened our engagement with our partners on the ground, particularly the UN resident coordinators and country teams in assessed member states. This has helped us integrate local, national, and regional developments into our analyses of key trends and our facilitation of delivery of technical assistance, which will in turn translate into more effective and impactful counterterrorism and CVE outcomes. We continue to have our insights through our regular stream of publications, including our recent analyses of the potential short and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on terrorism and counterterrorism. In June, pursuing the Security Council Resolution 2462, CTAT and the monitoring team produced a joint report on countering terrorism financing based on responses from 112 member states. The report was followed by a close briefing of the Council. In July, we conducted a virtual global consultation with over 15 civil society organizations on counter-financing of terrorism and the implications for human rights in accordance with that Resolution 2462. CTAT is committed to continued dialogue with civil society on issues related to counterterrorism and countering violent extremism within a human rights compliant and gender-sensitive framework. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic will undoubtedly make our already complex task even more difficult. But the pandemic has also given us an opportunity to question the status quo. We should continue to use this opportunity to review and strengthen our counterterrorism and CVE approaches. We must collectively uphold our shared principles of a rule of law-based international order and develop human rights compliant and gender-sensitive policies, practices, and whole of society approaches. Our determination to ensure justice, equality, and human dignity must continue to be the cornerstone of a multilateral counterterrorism effort. I do thank you, Mr. President.
Ms. Michelle Conins, the Executive Director of the City Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate. And now I would like to invite members of the Council to make their statement. On my list, I have the Russian Federation. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, allow me to thank USG, Voronkov, and ASG Conins for the in-depth analysis of the situation in the area of countering the threats posed by ISIL. The 11th report of the Secretary General provides a comprehensive overview of the situation on the ground, including insights on how the terrorists adapt to the circumstances of the COVID-19. We note with appreciation that this document duly reflects assessments of these trends provided by various states, including Russia. At present, the level of the global terrorist threat, despite the failure of the leaders of ISIL to build a pseudo-caliphate in Syria and Iraq, still remains high. The principles of organization and tactics used by ISIL suggest that it has now fully transformed into a network structure with a high degree of autonomy of branches and sleeping cells in various countries and regions of the world. The high command of the organization, having sufficient financial resources, is restoring mechanisms for coordinating and planning terrorist attacks on the border area between Syria and Iraq. At the same time, terrorists do not intend to give up plans to revive the caliphate in Iraq. ISIL continues to build up its combat potential and it is seeking to expand the area and scope of terrorist attacks in the country. The determination of ISIL to focus on the expansion across the African continent is now obvious. At the same time, not only the states of the Sahara-Sahel zone, where ISIL branches are already actively operating, but also countries of Central and Southern Africa are in sight of the ISIL members. A difficult situation is developing in Afghanistan, where approximately 4,000 ISIL fighters are present. The main units are concentrated in the eastern provinces of Kunar and Nangarhar, where their numbers reach 2,000 terrorists. According to various estimates, in the north of the country, it may also amount to 2,000 individuals. Supporters of the World Caliphate regularly carry out large-scale terrorist attacks in various cities of the country, mainly against the Shiite minority. Recently, there has been an increase in the interest of the international terrorist organizations' leaders towards South and Southeast Asia, which in their opinion, are promising in terms of recruiting new supporters. The spread of COVID-19 provoked large-scale socioeconomic turbulence around the world and diverted the attention of many states from the counterterrorism agenda, which in its turn paves the way for the international terrorist organizations to increase their deadly potential. Terrorists are seeking to use the coronavirus pandemic to increase the number of supporters, primarily at the expense of those dissatisfied with the actions of the authority in the context of the crisis, as well as in order to carry out hybrid attacks that combine terrorist attacks, biothreat, and spreading propaganda and inciting terrorist acts. Recently, there has been a noticeable increase in activity of the international terrorist organizations on the internet, where calls for supporters to hold various actions in order to increase panic in society are spreading on. ISIL leaders are brainwashing their supporters and recommend their followers to intensify their activity. At the same time, the pandemic has somewhat disorganized the relocation of terrorists between hotspots and made it difficult to deliver funds and weapons to conflict zones. Some terrorist cells lack money and arms. In particular, branches of ISIL in North Africa lost profit from smuggling and human trafficking due to the closure of borders between countries. However, despite these obstacles, international and regional terrorist groups are rapidly adapting to the pandemic and increasing the number of their supporters. Undoubtedly, there still is a huge room for improvement in the area of international cooperation. In particular, in the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters and their family members to the countries of their origin. Among the most vulnerable in this regard are women and children associated with foreign terrorist fighters currently trapped in camps and detention facilities in the Middle East. The Secretary General's report once again sheds light on the insufficient repatriation rates and the horrific conditions in which these people have to fight for their lives. Unfortunately, this is the battle that some of our colleagues, including in the Council, decided to withdraw from. It is totally unacceptable to prioritize issues of human rights and at the same time to deny innocent children their right to live. Russia stands firmly for ensuring support of repatriation efforts of states by the Security Council. Any resolution of the Council addressing the fight against terrorism at this time cannot fail to recognize this problem. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States. Ambassador Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Undersecretary General Voronkov, for this informative assessment of the evolving threat posed by ISIS and the ongoing UN efforts to counter it. Last year, we saw how our collective efforts resulted in ISIS's loss of territorial control and the death of its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. These victories in the battle against ISIS are a testament to the ongoing work of the global coalition to defeat ISIS. The coalition continues to pursue four main non-military lines of effort: counter-financing, counter-messaging, detention, repatriation, and accountability for crimes and abuses by foreign terrorist fighters, and stabilization of areas liberated by ISIS. it is critical that the coalition continues each of these efforts. The Secretary General's report made it clear that ISIS affiliates continue to pose a serious threat from West Africa to Southeast Asia. The United States seeks to call attention to the vast scale of this threat by identifying, sanctioning, and targeting each ISIS affiliate. Earlier this year, the United States worked with the council members to list 5 ISIS-affiliated terrorist organizations in the UN Security Council 1267 Sanctions Committee. We thank the many countries who co-sponsored these listings and encourage member states to join us in identifying, listing, and countering similar affiliates around the world. Even though ISIS and its so-called caliphate have been defeated on the battlefield, we must work together to ensure that the population of detained foreign terrorist fighters, as well as their family members displaced in Syria and Iraq, do not become a nucleus of an ISIS 2.0. We share the Secretary General's deep concerns regarding the thousands of foreign terrorist fighters and their family members, most of whom are young children, who are still in camps and detention facilities. Foreign terrorist fighters must face prosecution and accountability for their crimes, and we need to rehabilitate and reintegrate family members so a new generation of ISIS fighters does not emerge. The United States has led by example, bringing back our citizens and prosecuting them when appropriate. Countries must repatriate, prosecute, rehabilitate, and reintegrate foreign terrorist fighters and their families as appropriate. We are disappointed that Indonesia's effort to draft a meaningful resolution on prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of terrorists were stymied by council members' refusal to include repatriation. The world is watching. Will the Security Council make efforts to address the situation of foreign terrorist fighters and their family members left in Syria and Iraq? Or, like the Council did 2 weeks ago with our Iran arms embargo resolution, will members dismiss this grave threat to international peace and security and just simply bury their heads in the sand? We would also like to take this opportunity to challenge the Council to refuse to accept countries' attempts to misuse terrorism to pursue their own political ends. We are deeply concerned by the situation in Xinjiang, with more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims have been detained under the false guise of counterterrorism. Confinement that is imposed on the basis of vague indicators without fair trial guarantees is inconsistent with international law. Counterterrorism and countering violent extremism should never be used as a pretext to silence political discord or political dissent or freedom of expression, or to violate religious freedom or repress minority groups. The United States stands ready to work with our partners to prevent and counter terrorism while protecting and promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms. We can only hope our partners will rise to the occasion to join us, particularly when it comes to addressing threats emanating from Iran, the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam. Ambassador Cui, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank Under Secretary General Voronkov and Executive Directors Conins for their informative briefings. We highly appreciate the Secretary General's 11th strategic report on the threat of ISIL-Daesh. We share the concern that during the reporting period, the international community faces a two-pronged attacks from the COVID-19 pandemic and from the new attack by ISIL and their affiliates in many places, especially in conflict areas. Terrorists are using every opportunity to exploit and exacerbate has socioeconomic impact of the pandemic and prolonged conflict to their advantage. They sow discourse and radicalization, using their narratives on inequality, inequity, poverty, marginalization, and discrimination. These are stark reminders that terrorism, in all its forms and manifestations, remain a serious threat to international peace and security. We take this opportunity to thank the Indonesian presidency for consistently focusing the Council's attention on addressing the threat of terrorism. Mr. President, in this regard, my delegation wishes to stress the importance of the international and regional cooperation, as no country is safe until all is safe. It is particularly true when states have to stretch their resources domestically to meet other priorities. The Secretary General report confirms that the issues of foreign terrorist fighters returning to their home country or relocating to a third country is a growing challenge, in particular when the country reopened their border. The $100 million worth financial reserves owed by ISIL and various fundraising methods by terrorist groups add to the seriousness of the threat. It is therefore crucial to enhance sharing of intelligence, analysis between and among states about terrorist movements, imminent attacks, recruitment, financing, online propaganda, as well as building national capacity in law enforcement. At the global level, the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy continues to represent a comprehensive and effective framework for eliminating the threats with the central coordinating role of the United Nations. We welcome the instrumental role of the Office of Counterterrorism and Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, the monitoring teams, and various relevant UN agencies in providing technical assistance and capacity building. Their efforts to ensure business continuity, deliver technical assistance, and engage with the member states through online platforms deserve a special note. We wish to highlight the contribution of the recent virtual counterterrorism weeks in maintaining the momentum in the fight against terrorism. We welcome the emphasis on strengthening coherence, coordination, and effectiveness of United Nations counterterrorism work, particularly between the UNOCT and CTET. The COVID-19 pandemic shows how important it is to ensure the synergies and coordination of our action with limited resources. Last but not least, addressing the multi-dimensional threat of terrorism requires a comprehensive and holistic approach. We include addressing the conditions conducive to terrorism. We must remain firmly committed to preventing and resolving conflict, sustaining peace, promoting development, and ensuring respect for human rights for all, bringing the terrorists to justice and preventing them from returning to terrorism continue to be of utmost importance and must be carried out in accordance with the national law and international obligation. We are convinced that mutual legal assistance and sharing best practices in prosecution, reintegration, and rehabilitation of terrorists and their dependents are, as appropriate, can provide beneficial and should be furthered. It is also critical to adopt a whole-of-society approach by involving all actors, especially women, young people, non-governmental organizations, the private sector, and academia, in building balanced and cohesive society that are resilient to terrorism and radicalization. Mr. President, in closing, Vietnam maintains its firm position to reject terrorism and will continue to be a devoted partner in advancing our common struggles against terrorism on the basis of United Nations Charter, international law, and our common values. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. James, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Mr. President, and thanks also to our briefers, USG Voronkov and ASG Conins, for their briefings. Their message was clear. ISIL has not gone away. They remain a present and evolving threat. I also want to extend our thanks to you, Mr. President, for your stewardship of the resolution on terrorist prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration, which we hope to adopt shortly. The voice of this Council in condemning terrorism sends an important message So we're very grateful for Indonesia's efforts. Turning to today's debate, the United Kingdom welcomes the Secretary-General's report on the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security. We thank the monitoring team, CTED and OCT for their work. We have long been clear that the continued Daesh threat emanating from Syria and Iraq poses the most significant terrorism threat to the international community, as well as to the UK specifically. The UK is a leading member of the global coalition to counter Daesh, and we work closely with the United States and the United Arab Emirates on efforts to counter Daesh's propaganda. We are steadfast in our commitment to ensuring accountability for Daesh crimes. Today, we remember the appalling Daesh crimes committed against the Yazidi people in Sinjar 6 years ago. We strongly support the work of UNITAD, and in June, in conjunction with Nadia Murad, we launched the Draft Murad Code to ensure investigation into sexual violence crimes is safer, more ethical, and more effective. We noted the report's findings on the intersection between COVID-19 and counterterrorism. We provide extensive humanitarian assistance to states and partners to stem the impact of COVID outbreaks in conflict zones. The UK is closely monitoring the worrying COVID situation in Syria, and I urge fellow council members to do the same. We note also the report's points regarding online Daesh propaganda. We stress the need to address the conditions that Daesh exploits to mobilize support and resources. We should be clear that this is not an issue constrained to Daesh and its affiliates or splinter groups. The threat from right-wing terrorism has evolved and is growing, as USG Voronkov pointed out. The United Kingdom continues to act to undermine the growth of right-wing extremism and terrorism, including online, through the proscription of these groups in the United Kingdom. And we call on the international community to take a firm stand against all forms of terrorism. Mr. President, the UK is clear that those individuals who have fought for or supported Daesh, whatever their nationality, should face justice and accountability through prosecution in the most appropriate jurisdiction, often in the region where the crimes took place. The UN should support the international community in the prosecution of Daesh criminals in the region where their crimes have been committed. I remind the Council that justice mechanisms must be consistent with international law and must respect human rights and the rule of law, as well as ensuring fair trials and due process. This should be the case for all counterterrorism and national security measures undertaken by members of this Council. Under no circumstances should the mantle of counterterrorism or national security be used to justify actions that undermine these principles. This applies across the world, including in Xinjiang in China. We remain deeply concerned about the systematic, egregious human rights violations perpetrated against Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, which UN experts have said is incompatible with China's international human rights obligations. Our concerns are shared by other members of the international community, as demonstrated by the recent joint statement the UK delivered on Xinjiang on behalf of 28 countries at the 44th session of the Human Rights Council in June. We call on China to allow the Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights, her office, immediate and unfettered access to Xinjiang. The UK is clear that such disproportionate, wide-reaching and indiscriminate measures are not an effective means of preventing violent extremism or counterterrorism. Ultimately, they will be counterproductive and exacerbate ethnic tensions and the risk of terrorism. Mr. President, Daesh's global footprint should remain a significant concern for the entire international community. The UN must continue to play a central role in building states' capacity to assess the risks posed by Daesh and to counter their poisonous ideology. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium. Belgium, you have the floor. Anne?
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to thank Under-Secretary General Voronkov and Assistant Secretary General Conins for their presentations. Thanks to the efforts of the Global Coalition to defeat Daesh, of which Belgium is an active member, the Syrian and Iraqi territories were freed from the control of the Islamic State terrorist group. However, the latter maintains its presence in the region, and other small groups driven by the same ideology continue to spread in other parts of the world, and notably in the Sahel, Western Africa, or the Chad Lake region, hereby attempting to take profit of a damaged security situation. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the threat posed by ISIL is multifaceted but not yet clear. Although the measures taken by the member states to fight against the pandemic may have complicated the activities of the terrorist group, we still see an increase of its activities in Iraq and Syria, and more particularly in the most fragile regions. In the coming months, it will be important to remain vigilant and to continue to assess the situation in order to prevent any resurgence of this organization in the region. Furthermore, during the pandemic, the group's offensive propaganda efforts, mainly on online platforms, have benefited from a fragile, confined audience, particularly among the most vulnerable groups in our societies who feel marginalized and downgraded. Preventing and fighting against such hate speech must remain a long-term priority, as they contribute to exacerbating radicalization leading to violent extremism and terrorism. As you stated, the threat posed by Daesh and its followers is constantly evolving, and thus requires that all member states remain vigilant and adapt in a quick, flexible way. In this context, on June the 16th, the Council of the European Union updated its conclusions on EU external actions on preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism, which form the basis of the EU actions in this domain. Those new conclusions will allow the EU to continue its action while adapting to the evolution of the Islamic threat and to the emergence of new ones, including the rise of far-right terrorism. Mr. President, Belgium condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. My country is convinced that the fight against terrorism can only succeed if it fully complies with human rights and international humanitarian law, which must constitute a leading principle in all 4 pillars of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. For this reason, and together with its European partners, Belgium ensures that measures taken to fight terrorism do not negatively impact human rights and humanitarian activities on the ground, including in the Syrian camps. The foreign terrorist fighters issue constitutes a major challenge for our common security. Therefore, my country favorably welcomes the development to prevent travel for terrorist purposes and underlines the importance to bring terrorists to justice, while continuing to fight against the root causes of radicalization leading to extremism and terrorism. At the same time, developing specific rehabilitation and reintegration programs for men and women suspected of having committed terrorism-related crimes is crucial. It is also essential to differentiate the status of children from those of men and women, and to primarily consider them as victims of terrorism. Mr. President, Belgium considers that a successful fight against violent extremism and terrorism requires a comprehensive approach. This comprehensive approach is reflected on the military level with 4 Belgian F-16s in support of the coalition's operations from October onwards for a period of 1 year, as well as on the stabilization level with a contribution of €4 million in 2020 in the terrorists freed from Daesh. We also promote an inclusive whole-of-society approach. Youth, women, the private sector, civil society, and officers or victims of terrorism all contribute to the development of efficient, relevant, and sustainable policies. Their voices must be heard and integrated in our counter-terrorism strategies. Finally, and despite the fragmentation of our efforts caused by the current pandemic, it is essential that our coordination and cooperation in counter-terrorism be reinforced on the international, regional, but also national levels. In this framework, Belgium wishes to underline its appreciation for the flexibility of all UN entities who managed to continue to successfully fulfill their mandate in the difficult circumstances in past months. Together with all our partners, Belgium will remain fully committed to eradicate the threat posed by Daesh. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium. Now I would like to invite the distinguished representative of South Africa. Martinez, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as we enter your last full week, we'd like to commend Indonesia on the job, the well done job, and how it's conducted our work. And we appreciate all the efforts that your presidency have put in. Mr. President, we'd like to thank the briefers for the insightful perspective on the Secretary General's 11th strategic level report on the threat posed by ISIL to international peace and security and the range of United Nations efforts in support of member states in countering the threat. Mr. President, appropriately, this meeting takes place shortly after the United Nations marked the 3rd International Day of Remembrance of and tribute to the victims of terrorism on the 21st of August this year. It was an event in which provided a moving and timely reminder of the immense human costs and result from terrorism. As humanity continues to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, South Africa strongly supports the call by His Excellency, Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres, in calling for an immediate global ceasefire in all corners of the world. Mr. President, much like the COVID-19 pandemic that is proving to be such a stubborn threat despite massive efforts against it, the Secretary General's report illustrates that ISIL-Daesh remains a similarly stubborn threat to international peace and security. The report describes a new surge of ISIL activity in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, whilst everywhere the group continues to pursue its deadly agenda via new affiliations in different regions of the world. In terms of the ongoing challenge of individuals with suspected links to ISIL, especially women and children stranded in camps or being held in the northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic, South Africa is encouraged by the progress made by the UN's leadership in its development of a global multi-agency framework to assist member states with the protection, repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of third country nationals returning from Syria and Iraq. The report also describes the inherent risks of greater online recruitment and radicalization of a much larger captive audience, making greater use of the internet as a substitute for activities restricted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Equally important is the report's mention of the possibility that the widespread economic depression resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic could lead to an exacerbation of socioeconomic challenges linked to radicalization and terrorism. South Africa has consistently sought to highlight the importance of measures to address these root cause issues that give rise to the resentment that ultimately fuel terrorism. On this point, we urge the UN and its member states not to allow the COVID-19 pandemic to prevent us from reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by their target dates, which would inevitably allow extremist movements throughout the world to take further root. Mr. President, we are of course particularly concerned by the situation in Africa, as has been mentioned by some of the other members. As the report details, the persistent instability in Libya continues to provide fertile ground on the spread of terrorism on the continent. At the same time, Islamic State affiliates in the form of Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, Islamic State West Africa Province, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia, as well as Islamic State Central Africa Province, continue to carry out frequent attacks whilst attempting to entrench their operations and strengthen their ties with ISIL core and local strategic partners. Naturally, a key concern for South Africa is the situations described in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where ISCAP has continued its attempts to establish a greater operational presence and has carried out attacks against the DRC government and MONUSCO forces. We are also particularly concerned about the insurgency which is gripping northern parts of South Africa's neighbor, Mozambique, where some attacks were claimed on behalf of ISIL. Both of these situations are the focus of high-level regional attention by the Southern African development community. Indeed, only a few days ago, the leaders of SADC's 16 member states expressed their commitment to support Mozambique in addressing terrorism and violent attacks. It is important that these regional efforts continue to enjoy the full support of the international community and the UN. Allow me in this regard to express South Africa's appreciation to the United Nations for its continued support, including the UN Counterterrorism Centre's valuable contribution to a Southern Africa-wide counter-financing of terrorism operational plan, developed and implemented in collaboration with the Eastern and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group. Mr. President, allow me to conclude by reiterating South Africa's steadfast condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and our strong commitment to supporting UN-led efforts to fight this scourge. As always, we call for the further development and enhancement of regional strategic partnerships, including the African Union, and we emphasize the critical importance of ensuring that all of our counter-terrorism measures across the board are conducted in accordance with international human rights and humanitarian law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You have the floor now.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I wish to begin by joining Council members in thanking USG Voronkov and Executive Director Conins for their valuable briefings on the threats that ISIL poses to international peace and security. St. Vincent and the Grenadines remains profoundly concerned about the acts of violence and atrocious crimes committed by ISIL and its affiliates. Recent terrorist attacks across the globe demonstrate that despite its territorial defeat in Iraq and Syria, ISIL is continuing to expand its network, threatening state authority and disrupting peaceful societies as it carries out attacks against innocent civilians. We also note with particular concern the findings of the Secretary General's report that the global threat from ISIL is likely to increase in the medium to long term if the international community fails to comprehensively address this threat. Also disturbing is the observation that the inequalities and social fractures accelerated and magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic have the potential to feed into a vicious cycle of destabilization and violence that ISIL is keen to exploit. In order to address the threats to international stability and security engendered through ISIL's continued expansion, the international community should renew its commitment to strengthen cooperation, bolster stability, and enhance institutional capacities across all regions. Comprehensive strategies that promote social inclusion and cohesion, including through sustainable social and economic development initiatives, should be advanced in order to build resilient societies and reduce radicalization. Moreover, all counterterrorism actions must be conducted in accordance with international law and with the full implementation of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions and the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. We must also effectively and efficiently share information responsibly with our law enforcement and intelligence community partners. Countering the financing of terrorism is also an essential part of the global fight against terror. Thus, it is of utmost importance to monitor the changes in terror financing techniques utilized by ISIL. Similarly, in an effort to combat emerging terrorist financing risks, we call on the international community to fully implement Resolution 2462, which requires member states to disrupt and to criminalize financing of terrorism for any purpose. In this regard, we commend the efforts made by CTED and UNOCT in the area of terrorist financing and welcome the recent launch of a global capacity building program pursuant to Resolution 2462. on the prevention and suppression of the financing of terrorism. We underscore, however, that all initiatives to combat terrorist financing must be designed in such a way that they safeguard all legitimate and well-managed financial activities, including offshore jurisdictions. Mr. President, in conclusion, we underscore the central role of the United Nations in preventing and countering terrorism. The threats posed by terrorism can only be defeated through increased regional and international cooperation and a comprehensive approach, with the active contribution and participation of all member states. Finally, we reaffirm our commitment to contributing to the global efforts to preventing and countering terrorism. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger. Ambassador Abari, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for organizing this debate, and thanks also to the briefers. Mr. President, the Secretary General report shows that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the activities of the Islamic State terrorist organization have increased in Iraq, Syria, and through some of its affiliates in other parts of the world. This situation highlights the resilience of the organization, which, despite the military defeat it has suffered and the death of its main leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, remains at the center of the international terrorist threat. Today, the group is seeking to rebuild itself and regain its former operational capacity, exploiting all the loopholes and fragilities of the international security system as it confronts the management of the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. Indeed, the two terrorist organizations, ISIL and Al-Qaeda, have issued statements urging their supporters to exploit every opportunity offered by the pandemic to recruit, plan, and execute attacks, thus ignoring all calls for peace and unity, including the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire to better address this health crisis. Fortunately, the measures taken by states to reduce the spread of the virus among populations seem, for the time being, also to reduce the risk of the terrorist attacks in many states. Similarly, lockdown measures by reducing gatherings have had the effect of reducing the number of potential terrorist targets, such as crowded streets, public transport, and popular demonstration. However, it should be stressed that the socio-economic and political impact of the pandemic, by further weakening certain sections of the population, could create conditions conducive to the spread of the terrorist hate ideology and widen their recruitment base. On the African continent, the propaganda of terrorist groups affiliated with ISIL and Al-Qaeda is based on the psychological and economic tensions generated by the rapid spread of the virus and the lack of effective treatment for the disease. The impact of the pandemic, which has led to the suspension of rotations within peace missions, has also had the effect of reducing the movements of the defense and security forces, allowing some terrorist groups to occupy territories they had lost. Terrorists presented the pandemic as a divine punishment for non-believers. In some remote areas, they took advantage of the absence of the state to divert aid and position themselves as alternative service providers, medical care, water, and food, in order to gain the support of the local population. It is this context that allowed the attack to take place in Kure, a wildlife sanctuary located a few dozen kilometers from Niamey, which resulted in the death of 6 French aid workers and their 2 Nigerian guides. This attack in a park where the last giraffes in West Africa can still be observed in their natural habitat, in addition to depriving the local population of the benefits of tourism, has led to my country as a whole to being classified as a red zone, which means that with the exception of the capital Niamey, it is not safe for visit. That is an unfair treatment because Niger is making enormous sacrifices, not only to secure its territory, but also to participate in mechanisms such as the G5 Sahel to contribute to the fight against terrorism in the Sahel. Mr. President, at a time when the world attention is almost entirely focused on combating the spectacular spread of the coronavirus, the battle against terrorism in Africa has taken on an even more worrying dimension. Indeed, terrorist groups such as Boko Haram, the Islamic State of West Africa Province, the Jamaat Nasratul Islam wal Muslimin, the Islamic State of the Great Sahara, and Al-Shabaab have undeniably intensified attacks in their areas of operation, while the Islamic State province in Central Africa continued its deadly attacks against civilians and security forces in Mozambique and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. From January to April 2020, the continent recorded 508 terrorist attacks, resulting in 2,938 deaths compared to the same period in 2019, when 497 attacks and 2,584 deaths were recorded, representing a 2.21% increase in the number of attacks and a 30.70% increase in deaths. The Sahelian belt of West Africa recorded the highest number of attacks and deaths compared to the rest of the continent. 16 attacks resulted in 48 deaths in Southern Africa, particularly in Mozambique, and 10 attacks resulted in 30 deaths in Northern Africa. The 5 most affected countries in the first 4 months of 2020 were Mali, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Somalia, and my own country, Niger. In order to better protect their populations, the countries affected by these atrocities have pooled their forces. Thus, the military operations conducted within the framework of the multinational joint force have considerably weakened the terrorist group of Boko Haram operating in the Lake Chad Basin, while the G5 Sahel force continues to record successes against elements of the EIGS and JNIM groups. These forces, which were set up by our various countries, are being assisted, which is commendable in this struggle by partner countries and institutions. Allow me at this point to express the gratitude of my country, Niger, as well as that of all the countries of the G5 Sahel and the multilateral force, to the friendly countries that are supporting our security forces in this fight against terrorism and that, like us, are losing servicemen. Mr. President, as the scourge of the coronavirus pandemic continues to spread throughout the world, the international community should take all measures to prevent terrorist groups from continuing to exploit existing social fractures and vulnerabilities. States must maintain the level of commitment and vigilance that enables the military defeat of ISIL in Iraq and Syria. These efforts must be extended with the same determination to other regions of the world affected by the same atrocities. As the Secretary General said at the opening of the United Nations Virtual Week on the fight against terrorism from 6 to 10 July 2020, I quote, "Terrorism, like the COVID-19 virus, does not respect national borders. It affects all nations and can only be defeated collectively." End of quote. The international community has a duty to reaffirm its commitment and solidarity towards multilateralism and unity of purpose. To be effective, our actions must be inclusive, concerted, and guided by the 4 pillars of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. I thank you, Mr. President, for your kind attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Niger. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Undersecretary General Voronkov and the Executive Director Conins for their briefings. I welcome the 11th report by the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL to international peace and security. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the profound changes the world is undergoing and the severe challenges the mankind is facing. Inequalities within and between countries have been laid bare. Ignorance, anxiety, stigma, and politicization that comes with the pandemic have led to hatred and xenophobia, which have been aggregated and amplified by the popular use of social media. Although the pandemic appears to have temporarily reduced the risk of terrorist attacks, the socio-economic fallout from the crisis have the potential to exacerbate conditions conducive to terrorism. It could fit into a vicious cycle of destabilization and violence, and increase the midterm to long-term threat, which ISIL and other terrorist organizations are keen to explore and exploit. According to the Secretary General's report, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the world is witnessing a surge of activities of terrorist organizations such as ISIL in Iraq and Syria to rebuild their global operation capability. Terrorists, including ISIL, are also infiltrating into North Africa, in particular Libya, and worsening regional turbulence. ISIL has also announced that they may use virus as a biological weapon to launch terrorist attacks. Member states must remain highly vigilant to all these dangerous developments. Facing the unprecedented challenges of the COVID-19 and the common enemy of terrorism, we must bear in mind that we humankind is a community, and we should strengthen cooperation to jointly address the threat facing us. First, international counterterrorism cooperation should follow the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and continue to leverage the central coordinating role of the UN and the Security Council with unified standard. In fighting terrorism, we must respect the primary responsibility of member states and the sovereignty of countries concerned. We should comprehensively implement relevant Security Council and the General Assembly resolutions and the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. During and after the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to further promote multilateralism and strengthen international cooperation in a joint effort to fight terrorism. Second, we must adopt integrated policies to address the root causes as well as the symptoms of terrorism to eradicate its breeding grounds. The international community should push for political settlement of hotspot issues, resolve differences peacefully, assist member states in poverty reduction and eradication and sustainable development, and encourage dialogue among civilizations and religions. We should support regional organizations such as the AU to play an important role. Assistance should be given to developing countries, especially African countries, to help build capacity for counterterrorism and de-radicalization. There is an urgent need for the international community to strengthen cooperation in fighting and overcoming COVID-19 and reduce its potential impact on terrorist threat. Third, it's important to enhance international judicial cooperation and adapt it to the new trends and the features of terrorism. We should focus on the key issues such as the foreign terrorist fighters, the diversified means of terrorist financing, the misuse of the internet and communication technologies by terrorists, and the collusion of terrorist organizations with organized crimes. We should attach great importance to the impact of COVID-19 on counterterrorism and take timely measures to prevent terrorists from exploiting loopholes caused by the pandemic. Fourth, mechanisms such as the UN Office of Counterterrorism, Counterterrorism Committee, and the 1267 Committee should increase coordination and fully leverage their strengths and expertise to form greater synergy. UN counterterrorism mechanisms should act in strict accordance with the relevant resolutions and rules of procedure. They need to enhance communication with member states, strengthen coordination among themselves in terrorist threat assessment, capacity building of member states, and the use of sanctions, maintain the authority and effectiveness of the counterterrorism and the sanctions regime, and contribute more to international counterterrorism efforts. These mechanisms should readjust their working methods during the pandemic and make better use of online platforms to carry out their work according to the needs of member states. Mr. President, as an important player in the international fight against terrorism, China resolutely implements all relevant UN resolutions. We actively participate in international and regional counterterrorism cooperation through the UN, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other fora. We work closely with other member states in sharing intelligence and combating terrorist financing, transnational organized crime, and cyber terrorism. China will work with the international community to analyze in depth the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on global terrorist activities and continue to have bilateral and multilateral exchange and capacity building cooperation with other countries, especially developing countries, including those in Africa. We will continue to provide political and financial support to UN counterterrorism efforts for the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, having finished my prepared statement, I have to make a response to the remarks made by certain members against China. We categorically reject those remarks. They are baseless and absurd, as usual. Terrorism is our common enemy. There is no such thing as good terrorists or bad terrorists. China is firmly opposed to politicization and a double standard in counterterrorism. The situation in Xinjiang is totally China's internal affairs. It's not a religious issue or a human rights issue. It's about counterterrorism and anti-extremism. Xinjiang has suffered deeply from terrorism and violent extremism in the past. To address the threat, Xinjiang has taken a series of preventive counterterrorism and de-radicalization measures. This is consistent with Security Council resolutions, the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, and the UN Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism. These measures are widely supported by the people in Xinjiang and have yielded good results. Xinjiang has not seen a single terror incident in the past 3 years. Facts speak louder than words. Anyone that is fair-minded can tell right from wrong. Since late 2018, more than 70 foreign delegations visited Xinjiang. They see firsthand a stable, thriving, and developing Xinjiang, and agree that counterterrorism and de-radicalization efforts have made all this possible. However, it's really regrettable that the United States choose to ignore basic facts and repeat its rhetoric and keep smearing and discrediting the counterterrorism and the de-radicalization efforts in Xinjiang. We urge the United States to listen to the international community, admit facts, give up bigotry and a double standard, and stop interfering in China's internal affairs by using human rights as an excuse. If the United States truly care about human rights, it should do its own job first. Please protect the human rights of the American people. Please step up efforts to combat COVID-19 to safeguard lives and the health of American people. The United Kingdom followed the US again in putting up unfounded charges against China in the Council just now. We strongly opposed to it. The baseless remarks of the United Kingdom are sheer hypocrisy and double standard. We urge the United Kingdom to fix its own problems and stop interfering in China's internal affairs. Finally, I would like to emphasize that China is determined to safeguard its national sovereignty, security, and development interests. No interference will succeed, and no one can stop China's progress. I thank you, Chairman.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany. Ambassador Günther, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Johnny, thanks a lot. And thank you, Vladimir Voronkov and Michelle Conins, for the important work you're doing and for today's brief. I would like to make 3 remarks, some of them of a rather philosophical nature. The first one is on the approach that we have on fighting international terrorism and foreign terrorist fighters in particular. The second point is on the continuing threat emanating from Daesh. And the third point is on why it is important that we are serious about our values when it comes to fighting terrorism. Let me start with the first one. The issue of terrorism, including the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters, will remain on our agenda for the foreseeable future. Our goal must be, indeed, to make sure that there is a lasting defeat of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and all the other terrorist organizations and their gruesome ideologies. We therefore need to find the right responses here in this council, back home, and in all the conflict-torn regions on which terrorists focus, because they serve as a base of operation. We believe that we have 4 tools at our disposal. The first tool that works is respect. Disrespecting people and pushing them to the margins of society will make the world less safe, step by step. Inequality and injustice fuel the propaganda machinery of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the like. If the members of these United Nations fail at providing everyone with opportunities for a life in dignity, we will all fail in our fight against terrorism. The second tool is a second chance after adequate prosecution, respecting the principles of due process and fair trial. Rehabilitation and reintegration are not easy, but there is no humane alternative. The third tool that works is not trying to solve the problem alone, but working together. Here lies the true value of cooperation, be it internationally or within a society. International, regional, and sub-regional cooperation remains absolutely vital. There is a fourth tool in our view. Counterterrorism best works with a strong role for civil society organizations. But even more important are the stories of those human beings and individuals who lost a brother or a sister, a mother or a father, or a friend to terror. The stories of those who have lost their own lives. Let us also in this council remember those who stand at the front lines of this conflict, sadly, sometimes even at the cost of their lives. Together, we should honor the women and men in the field who do the actual work, members of the armed forces and of law enforcement, social workers, sometimes religious leaders, those working for urban and rural development. They are all the heroes of this struggle. My second point is on the threat that Daesh continues to pose. Bringing Daesh's territorial control to an end was an enormous achievement. Its withdrawal into the shadows, however, was not a reason to celebrate. As the Secretary General has reported, 2020 brought a surge in activity in Syria and Iraq. COVID-19 may keep the terrorists from traveling, but the terror continues wherever they dwell. So we must continue our counter-Daesh effects tirelessly. My third point is on why our values matter. It is also about double standards. And we have seen this morning quite a discussion on double standards already. Let me say this, our values are key to ensure that our response remains credible and effective. As soon as we are perceived as employing methods similar to those used by terrorists, we are losing the battle for the hearts and minds. And now I would like to jump into the discussion of this morning. Among the most important lessons we have learned in our struggle is that counterterrorism measures must never serve as a pretext for human rights violations. We all know examples of so-called counterterrorism measures that indiscriminately target ethnic minorities. That must not be our approach. The exclusion of ethnic minorities only makes those marginalized more prone to fall into the traps of violent extremism and terrorist networks. It counteracts all our efforts in trying to prevent terrorism. Regarding Xinjiang, the internment of large parts of the population is, in our view, unjustified. In the long run, it is prone not to reduce, but rather to increase the risk emanating of terrorist organizations. Counterterrorism measures are not to hinder the delivery of humanitarian assistance. This is another important aspect. By humanitarian actors consistent with international humanitarian law and based on the humanitarian principles. One more remark, we celebrate the 20th birthday of Resolution 1325 on women in armed conflicts these days. Gender is and remains an important element in countering the terrorist threat in a number of ways. On the one hand, women are often even more affected by violent conflict and terrorism than men. On the other hand, women are not only victims. Within Daesh, women have been among the perpetrators as well. They have assumed important and operative functions within the organization. We should therefore include female radicalization in the priorities on our agenda. One word on the weakest of all, children. Children have suffered dramatically under the so-called caliphate, and almost an entire generation may be lost. With a view to the ongoing negotiations on a resolution in which we intensively debate how children should be addressed, our position is clear. Children are victims of terrorism, victims of their upbringing, victims when they are born or brought into a region of conflict. After a certain age, they become juveniles who are responsible for their actions and must face the consequences. But before that, they are victims first and foremost. To protect them and lead them back into society should therefore be our most precious goal when we talk about rehabilitation and reintegration. In very concrete terms, we are, speaking for Germany, returning humanitarian cases, especially children on a case-by-case basis, when we're speaking about children who are German nationals. Each case is different and needs to be assessed on individual merits. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic. Ambassador Jose, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Undersecretary General Voronkov and Executive Director Conins for briefing us today on the threat posed by ISIL, Daesh. Of particular concern to us, having anticipated the latest report of the Secretary General on the subject, is precisely the state of this threat as a result of the devastating reality facing the world due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We watch with condemnation as the number of attacks and actions by ISIL increases in places like Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, where they consolidate their presence during this crucial moment when governments focus their actions and limited resources on saving lives, fighting to contain the spread of the virus. Despite the achievements made in the fight against ISIL, in particular at the top of its core organization, and here we commend the different counterterrorism strategies, operations taking place, their ability to adapt and mutate to new modalities in the face of external events, as in the case of the pandemic, demands us to maintain the offensive. On the other hand, we consider important to pay due attention to the socioeconomic impact of the crisis generated by the pandemic, as an element that could exacerbate conditions conducive to terrorism in the medium and long term. Mr. President, we also wish to stress our concern about the serious humanitarian situation that the people with alleged links to ISIL continue to face in camps and detention centers in conflict zones. Exposed to the plethora of conditions, many of them victims of sexual violence, which is in the case of Al-Hol camp in Syria, where the vast majority of its population are women and children. COVID-19 has added an additional element of destabilization to an already serious situation in these centers, exposing those admitted to a higher risk of contagion, and given the need to relocate resources to combat the pandemic, also to the detriment of efforts in matters of protection, repatriation, processing, rehabilitation, and reintegration. Therefore, it is necessary to strengthen initiatives and programs designed to counter-risk the exploitation and radicalization in camps and detention centers, with the assistance of specialized UN agencies for the development of internal strategies and protocols to better address the humanitarian, human rights, and security situation, also counting on the important support of the international community. Given the mobility and confinement restrictions imposed by COVID-19, which have considerably increased time spent online, we urge the relevant watch bodies to maintain the necessary alert levels to act against the increase of cybercrime for financing and ISIL propaganda in the media to inspire attacks by affiliates and by supporters. Likewise, of concern is the threat posed by the number of existing foreign terrorist fighters and the return of many to countries of origin, continuing to pose substantial political, legal, operational, and security challenge for member states. Mr. President, let me conclude by recognizing the essential work, particularly during the pandemic of COVID-19, of specialized in United Nations agencies such as UNODC, CTED, UNITAD, and UNICEF. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Ambassador Kais, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank both Under Secretary General Mr. Vladimir Voronkov and the Assistant Secretary General Ms. Michelle Conins for their comprehensive briefings. And I would like to seize this opportunity to express Tunisia's support and solidarity with the victims of terrorism and their families all over the world at the occasion of the third Independent International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to the victims of terrorism held 21st of August. Mr. President, as this report indicated, ISIL and Al-Qaeda continue to constitute a threat to international peace and security. Despite its previous military defeat in Syria and Iraq and the continued effort to combat its affiliate around the world, ISIL is attempting to reconstitute and rebuild its network and to readjust its continued ambition for territorial existence, particularly in conflict zones. The increase of number of terrorist attacks in Syria and Iraq compared to the same period last year is very concerning in this regard, despite the restriction imposed by the pandemic. Furthermore, ISIL still maintains ownership of important financial resources. It continues to exploit illegal activities, including organized criminal enterprise, and profits from donation and fundraisings, especially through social media campaigns. The accelerated decentralization between the central command in Daesh and Al-Qaeda and their remote affiliates has been increasingly visible, with local groups acquiring their own distinct regional characteristics and objectives. This may constitute both an opportunity and a threat. On the one hand, the lack of command with the recent deaths of several terrorist leaders creates a power vacuum that the international community needs to exploit in order to further distort the strategic direction of ISIL and Al-Qaeda and the effectiveness and outreach of their propaganda. However, on the other hand, affiliates are adapting themselves more to the regional context and are exploiting the local grievances by building financial, operational, and family ties with other terrorist and organized crimes groups, and by exacerbating tension among different ethnic groups in some contexts to fuel conflicts and insecurity. Tunisia expresses grave concern regarding the growth of terrorism and violent extremism in Africa, particularly in Libya, West Africa, and the Sahel regions, where terrorist groups are systematically undermining poor socioeconomic condition, marginalization, porous borders, and lack of security and political and social instability. We expressed particular concern regarding the recent reports of the travel of thousands of mercenaries from northwest Syria towards Tripoli. This relocation constitutes a major terrorist threat not only to Libya but to the whole region. The terrorist travel toward Libya can only prolong the conflict and renders it bloodier and more difficult to resolve peacefully. Tunisia calls upon the international community to uphold its obligation to disrupt terrorist travel and support. Mr. President, the pandemic has reduced to a certain extent terrorist threats in the world, given the difficulty of terrorist movement and their access to financial resources and regular means minimizing the opportunity for terrorist attacks against civilian and soft targets. Nonetheless, we should not ignore the possible medium and short and long-term effects of the pandemic on terrorist threat, as explained in Secretary General report and in CTED analytical paper. The unprecedented social, economic, and political challenges resulting from the pandemic have been quickly integrated into the strategies and propaganda of terrorist groups in order to escalate their attacks and spread hateful and extremist idea to a captive audience that is more than ever exposed to their online platforms. The dire economic and social consequences of the pandemic on countries and population have also increased the fragility of societies while pressuring member states' resources dedicated to countering terrorism and violent extremism measures. Such vulnerabilities can be exploited in the future to radicalize those most affected and marginalized. For these reasons, the purpose of terrorist threat should be comprehensive and multidimensional. First, member states need to maintain the necessary resources and focus on their counterterrorism priorities, as well as keeping and enhancing means of international coordination and cooperation despite the current pandemic in manner consistent with international law. Second, it is crucial to address the deep causes of terrorism and establish the necessary safeguards to build resilience against terrorism and radicalization through the promotion of human rights, gender equality, youth participation, sustainable economic development, and social cohesion. Tunisia also reiterates its call for international community to disrupt all safe havens of terrorism through the peaceful settlement of conflicts, particularly during COVID-19 pandemic. Third, the international community is required to address the threat posed by FTFs in a manner consistent with the realities, needs, and capacity of different member states. The Security Council has recognized in several of its resolutions that FTFs pose a serious threat to their states of origin and that they have, upon their return, attempted, organized, planned, and participated in terrorist attacks, including against soft targets. Tunisia reaffirms that member states need to ensure that all perpetrators of terrorist crimes are held accountable for their acts, including through judicial and law enforcement cooperation. In this regard, Tunisia is deploying extensive efforts in order to prevent radicalization, recruitment, and financing of terrorism, and to ensure border protection and mutual legal assistance. Finally, the UN needs to remain vigilant and unified in its response to terrorism during the pandemic. It is crucial that we adapt to the new and unprecedented challenges and that we ensure the continuity and efficiency of our response, particularly through the Security Council and its subsidiary bodies. The postponement of the global counterterrorism strategy review should not make us lose focus on the priority given to the counterterrorism efforts and should not hinder the respect of our international obligations and commitments, including international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. We remain committed to a multilateral and multi-stakeholder cooperation toward our common objective of a world free of terrorism. I thank you.
Representative of Tunisia. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Estonia. Estonia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Undersecretary Voronkov and Assistant Secretary Conins for their comprehensive briefings, introducing the fresh findings of the Secretary General's report on threats posed by ISIL and its affiliates. Mr. President, Estonia notes that command and control arrangements between ISIL war and its so-called provinces are loosening. Further, the ongoing pandemic has resulted in travel restrictions, which, according to Secretary General's report, have complicated terrorist planning and operation, making it harder for terrorists to move, recruit, and raise funds. In light of these changes, it is encouraging to hear that at least temporarily, the direct threat of terrorism appears to have decreased in various regions across the globe, at least temporarily. However, we must remain vigilant. We appreciate the role played by Eurojust and Europol in combating all forms of terrorism in the European Union and beyond, and welcome the increased cooperation of these agencies with the United Nations. Despite aforementioned positive developments, we remain concerned about conflict-affected areas where ISIL continues to undermine regional security. As such, we note that compared with last year, attacks have increased in ISIL core areas, both in Syria and Iraq. Estonia further recognizes the threat posed by Islamic State in Greater Sahara. The organization continues to mount attacks on international security forces, as well as local communities in the three-border area of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In these areas, terrorism is closely interlinked with other forms of communal violence. Therefore, in order to address extremism and terrorism, we need a holistic approach, which could build truly resilient communities. More attention must be given to lowering intercommunal tensions and nurturing political reconciliation. Such activities often start at the grassroots level. Finally, the question of accountability and denying impunity to the perpetrators of crimes against civilians is an essential part of countering terrorism. It is also vital in healing communities, restoring trust, and creating conditions for sustainable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Estonia. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of France. Did you have the floor? France.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will deliver my intervention in French. Monsieur le Président, je remercie les briefers pour leur présentation. Je souhaite aborder 4 points. Tout d'abord, je veux rappeler la détermination de la France à poursuivre avec ses partenaires internationaux la lutte contre Daesh dans le cadre de la coalition internationale. Daesh a perdu son ancrage territorial avec la chute de Barouz en mars 2019, mais le groupe compte encore de très nombreux partisans au Levant et au-delà. Il a montré sa détermination à exploiter les opportunités créées par le contexte sanitaire pour intensifier ses actions violentes en Syrie et en Irak, mais aussi par le biais des groupes qui lui sont affiliés en Afghanistan, en Asie du Sud-Est et en Afrique. La menace est donc loin d'avoir disparu. Nous poursuivrons nos efforts au plan militaire, mais également au plan politique, pour traiter les causes profondes de l'émergence de Daesh. À cet égard, je tiens à rappeler notre conviction qu'il n'y aura pas de victoire complète et durable contre Daesh sans une solution politique à la crise syrienne, conforme aux termes de la résolution 2254. La France continue d'y œuvrer en soutien à l'action de l'envoyé spécial des Nations Unies. Elle contribue également au relèvement des territoires et des populations syriennes qui ont été libérées de Daesh grâce à l'action de la coalition internationale et qui sont aujourd'hui confrontées à une situation humanitaire difficile. En Irak, il est essentiel que la communauté internationale se tienne résolument aux côtés des autorités pour aider le pays à renforcer sa souveraineté et à permettre le développement économique de l'ensemble de son territoire. Il est également nécessaire de poursuivre nos efforts pour protéger concrètement les enfants contre le recrutement et l'endoctrinement, y compris par des groupes terroristes. Comme ce Conseil l'a reconnu il y a 5 ans par la résolution 2242, les filles sont particulièrement exposées à ces stratégies de recrutement. Dans cette même logique, nous devons poursuivre nos efforts en matière d'aide humanitaire pour assurer des conditions de vie dignes aux milliers de réfugiés et personnes vulnérables dans les régions touchées par le terrorisme et ainsi éviter autant que possible qu'elles ne rejoignent les rangs de groupes terroristes. Deuxièmement, je souhaite rappeler la nécessité de lutter efficacement contre le financement du terrorisme. Les capacités financières de Daesh se maintiennent à un niveau élevé. Il faut tarir ces ressources qui se diversifient. C'est une priorité de la France qui a porté la résolution 2462 en mars 2019. Nous appelons à sa pleine mise en œuvre, y compris s'agissant du respect par les États de leurs obligations au titre du droit international humanitaire. Troisièmement, je veux souligner l'importance de la lutte contre l'utilisation d'Internet à des fins terroristes. L'appel de Christchurch que nous avons lancé avec la Nouvelle-Zélande en mai 2019 réunit aujourd'hui une cinquantaine d'États et de partenaires, dont les grandes entreprises d'Internet. La participation de ces dernières est une condition essentielle pour garantir l'efficacité de la lutte contre les contenus terroristes en ligne. La pandémie de Covid-19 a conduit à une exposition accrue à la propagande terroriste. Il est donc essentiel de réguler l'utilisation d'Internet, qui ne peut pas être une zone de non-droit, tout en respectant impérativement la liberté d'expression. J'en viens ainsi à mon quatrième point, rappeler avec force que la lutte contre le terrorisme, la radicalisation et contre l'extrémisme violent doit se faire dans le respect du droit international humanitaire, des réfugiés et des droits de l'homme. De la même manière, cette lutte ne saurait justifier les attaques contre les civils ou le ciblage des acteurs, des infrastructures et des infrastructures humanitaires. Le respect des droits de l'homme et de l'état de droit, mais aussi l'éducation, l'inclusion et la cohésion sociale sont des facteurs clés de toute stratégie de prévention et de lutte contre le terrorisme. Enfin, je vais conclure un mot pour les victimes de Daesh et leurs familles. Je pense en particulier aux résidus du district de Sinjar, qui ont été victimes il y a 6 ans exactement de crimes de guerre et d'exactions commises par les hommes de Daesh. L'hommage aux victimes du terrorisme qui a eu lieu vendredi a rappelé l'importance de placer les victimes au cœur de notre action collective contre le terrorisme. Celles-ci ont droit à la justice et la France soutient à cet égard l'action d'UNITAD en Irak, comme elle soutient les initiatives permettant de lutter contre l'impunité en poursuivant les auteurs présumés de crimes au plus près de l'endroit où ces crimes ont été commis. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Now I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Indonesia. Like others, I wish to thank USG Voronkov and ISG Conins for their briefing. Let me also express my gratitude to the monitoring team, CTED, UNOCT, and the other UN-related entities for the report before us. In February of this year, I had the pleasure of accompanying USG Voronkov and ISG Conins and the coordinator of the 1967 monitoring team on the first ever joint high-level visit to Jakarta. I believe that visit underlined Indonesia's comprehensive and balanced approach to the fight against terrorism, including the strategies in prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration, or PRR. The importance of developing PRR strategy has also been highlighted in the Secretary General's report. Indonesia is of the view that the PRR strategy, as an integral part of a comprehensive and tailored approach to addressing the threat posed by terrorists, is instrumental in counter-terrorism efforts. Therefore, providing a clear guidance for member states to develop and implement comprehensive PRR strategies should be one of the imminent priorities for our Council. This applies also to the continuing humanitarian and security challenges posed by FTF and their accompanying family members. We also note that the issues of relocation and returning FTF and their accompanying family members present significant challenges for member states. In this regard, we believe that an effective comprehensive PRR strategy is pertinent. We have to set our differences aside and show our unity once again in our collective efforts in fighting the scourge of terrorism. Dear colleagues, my delegation takes notes of the various salient points in the report, particularly concerning how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted counter-terrorism efforts and amplified threats through media propaganda. With this in mind, allow me to make 3 brief points. The first point relates to the terror by ISIL affiliates, which continue to threaten other parts of the globe. The report clearly demonstrates that ISIL affiliates are still active in many parts of the world, even as the world now faces the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that this threat remains and works through media propaganda, which may lead to inspired attacks once normal public mobility and assembly resume. This leads to my second point, which is countering propaganda. Indonesia believes that we should always invest in soft measures towards countering terrorist narrative and steering people away from the violent extremism that is conducive to terrorism. We need to promote and facilitate the spread of messages of peace, moderation, and tolerance as the best approach to confronting terrorist propaganda. We must provide messages which turn back negativity and at the same time amplifies positivity and hope. My third and last point, our fights against terror should neither cease nor waver despite the pandemic. The pandemic should in no way hinder our fight against terrorism, as that would be the best hope for the terrorists. Let us not permit the pandemic to create more terrorists or let their affiliate regroup or consolidate. We need to stay attuned to how the threat of ISIL continues to develop during and after the pandemic to adjust its response. We should be adaptive. Resolution 2532 of 2020 adopted last month anticipated this, as it called for the immediate cessation of hostility during the pandemic, except in the fight against terrorist groups. To that end, Indonesia would like to reaffirm our commitment to work together with all countries and the UN to strengthen our counter-terrorism cooperation. I thank you. Now I would like to resume my function as President of the Council. I see that there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.